Hi and welcome to the Aspire Europe Competent Programme Controls course. In this video we're going to work our way through designing quality. My name is Rod Sowden. I was the lead author for P3M3 and MSP and also Managing Director of Aspire Europe, and I'll be taking you through all the videos on the course. So, programme quality is quite an abstract concept. I think if we were looking down at project world, if we draw on what we know from Prince2 and APM and the other PMI and the other methodologies, then we kind of know it's about saying what you want, checking that you've got it. But how do we cascade that down through the hierarchy of control levels? So if we take from a program perspective, we've got strategic objectives that come into the program. We then develop a vision. We then develop a target operating model or blueprint. And then that cascades down into the business requirements that then drop down into the project world. And then coming back up the V diagram, we have the program capability building as the projects deliver us their outputs. We transition that into getting outcomes. That delivers our benefits and we achieve our objectives. So relatively straightforward, but certainly not as tangible as what we see when we're dealing with projects and we can see a gizmo or a widget that we can use, that we can measure and check it's working. So if we continue with this idea, we then have to consider that within a program, we'll have our target operating model and blueprint, but that is going to spawn numerous business requirements, which in its turn will spawn numerous projects, which will be delivering outputs and capabilities all over the place, which then come back into the program for assembly, transition, and improvements. So the further we go down, the more complex the world becomes, and it's much harder to keep control over it. So how do we make sure that there's checks and balances in place on the way through? Now, if we look at, and we will do in a minute, some examples, it is always small changes in the project world that blow the program out the water. It's very rare that there's change in the program world. It's because it's assembling and aggregating things from below. So when we're thinking about specifying quality, let's just take a scenario around, say, if we wanted to put air conditioning system into a car. When we decide to put that into a car, which in its fact, when you're building a new car, it is a program, it's multiple capabilities going into a vehicle. So we've got to think about where that's going to fit into the car, how it interacts with other parts of the car, like the dashboard and the interfaces to other components, how much electricity and power it's going to draw out of the car, what's that going to do to the charging system, how will it operate within the space and what will it do with the hot air, all that kind of stuff. And so we need to look at the sort of testing mechanism. We have a system requirements. What does the whole thing need to do? If you're looking at something like HS2 or Crossrail or a major digital implementation, we need to see what that whole system does. I mean, we were doing some work on a big digital transformation. They were using Agile and they were just picking off bits of the digital services because they could get quick wins, but nobody had any picture of how this whole thing was going to fit together. So we need to think about system specifications, system designs, and then unit design. Then it gets built and we come back up the other side to acceptance testing at different levels of component geometry. So we need to be looking at this from a program perspective. And if you're delivering something big, it is a huge amount of work. But honestly, it's not going to go away. So we need to think about these things, about how does this V diagram come from the strategic objective for the program down to that lowest component. And that's where we talked about in our planning design about different tiers. You've got tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 of components in the plan that we need to be tracking. So when we're thinking of developing the testing system, there's a whole range of people that we need to be thinking about. We need to be thinking about our customers and our supply chain. Is it doing what they want? So if we're thinking, say you were British Gas or BT rolling out a big new service, we've got to think about the customers. We've got to think about the people who've designed, build it, support the system. People are going to maintain it internally. And what does it do to our capital machinery and that kind of stuff. So when we're designing this, we've really got to think about these hugely complex tasks. If you were putting a new digital railway system in, you think about all the components, or the trains that have to be done, the signalling systems, the stopping lights, every aspect of digitalisation of the railway. Same with the roads. We've got digital motorways now. You think about all those things that need to be in place to quality check that all that stuff works. And there's been a loss of faith in some ways of digital motorways as they've taken away the inside lane in the UK. Well, actually, if we look back and think what was supposed to be designed as, you're supposed to be digital systems that were monitoring the lanes, and it transpired they weren't in. What we've actually got is more reliable vehicles, so it's not been as bad as it could have been. But elements of that system were never put in, so you should then really question about whether any of it should have gone live without those safety mechanisms in place. So if we look at where this really goes badly, probably the biggest, most scariest one that we've seen in recent times was the Boeing 737 MAX. Yep, and what caused that problem? Okay, well, we know it is component interactivity. IA was getting involved, automated intelligence was getting involved, taking over the plane and crashing it and costing people's lives. But where was the root cause of that? The lack of independence between Boeing and the FAA in the US. That's where the problem really lied. So when they were looking at the testing system, we don't really know what was happening between the individuals, but there were individuals there that were clearly motivated to get that thing through. So when we're putting our quality and assurance strategy together, we really need to make sure that there's independence in place so that there's rigor. When we're doing a P3M3 assessment, especially a reassessment, we have to make sure that we're not being, how can I put it, courted by the client or sucked in. We need to make sure that we've got validation that what we're seeing, it might be what we want to see, but is it the right thing? So that we don't become too cozy. Now, there's another dimension to quality in a program environment, and that's basically how it runs itself. Okay. Now, as the lead author of MSP, I've battled with the word quality across two versions of the book, and it kind of evolved to the point where we were kind of relatively happy with it. So what we defined quality as was really around the quality of the people that we've got working in it. And the fact you're doing this course tells us that whatever program you're on is pushing you, or you're pushing yourself to be the best. The quality of our processes and the way they fit together, the quality of the way we govern the program, so leadership, and the quality of the components, so that we've got a blueprint, that we've got requirements, we've got plans, we've got strategies that set out how things are going to work. But it's not just the program, it's the operations staff. How good are they at change? Have we given them the skills to be able to cope in the future? So quality is a big thing in a program, but let's think about it in terms of it's about the people, the process, got to think about the tools and systems that we're using, and about the nature of our contracts. Now, another unfortunate case study in the UK was Crossrail 2020, and these are just a quick summary of the findings. Now, if ever you've looked at a list of things that suggested there was not adequate internal quality control in a program, here they are. However, what I would say is I'm sure the people that worked on that program were fantastic, highly intelligent, brilliant people, but somehow this was not joining together. And just a quick summary here, we've ended up with complicated signaling systems that don't interface. Yeah, you've got commercial models that simply don't work, and we're basically set up to rip the program off, in effect. Repeated assurance reviews must have been too cozy with the program because they were missing early warning indicators. And despite it must have been absolutely obvious this thing was not going to go live, there was a refusal within the governance model to accept it wasn't going to go live on the date up to 4 months before it went live. And now we're looking at 2 years on and we're still talking about a year or two away. So that can only lead us to weak governance and weak leadership, which obviously goes with governance, and then biases that meant information was being ignored. and we'll talk about this in the leadership and bias module as well. But just one point that came out at the start of this, the first tranche of this program was the tunneling, and that tunneling was pretty successful. And this created false optimism. Now that happened in the Olympics. The first tranche of the Olympics, they built the stadiums, it all looked great. The next tranche was readiness to go live, and that had some delays. And part of the problem was the people that were at the top, the program board, were the people that were successful at building a stadium. And I'm sure the people in this program were successful tunnelers. The next tranche of people needed to be successful readiness for the games, or in this case, systems integration, but they still had the same people running it at the top. And that is a great example of what MSP talks about transitioning leadership during the life cycle of a program. Okay, well, I hope that proved useful to you. Now time for you to get back to the course, have a cup of coffee, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the module.